The summer Eli Morgan turned 23, he learned that the ground beneath a man's feet could disappear without warning. It happened on a Tuesday morning in July of 1976. His father, Roy Morgan, had gone out before dawn to repair an irrigation pump on the far edge of their 40-acre farm in Vermilion Parish, Louisiana. By the time Eli walked out with a second cup of coffee, Roy was already gone. Not gone to town, not gone to a neighbor's place. Gone the way men go when their hearts simply stop in the middle of an ordinary morning with grease on their hands and work still left to do. The funeral was small, the debts were not. Eli stood at the kitchen table 3 days after they buried his father and looked at the papers spread across the oilcloth. Loans on equipment, a second mortgage taken out during a bad harvest 2 years earlier, accounts past due at the feed store and the co-op. The numbers did not add up to disaster in a dramatic way. They added up to disaster the slow way, which is worse. The kind where you can see exactly how long you have before everything collapses. He was 23 years old, broad-shouldered from years of physical work with dark hair and the kind of quiet face that people sometimes mistook for coldness. He was not cold, he was simply careful. He had learned that from his father too, though he did not recognize it as a lesson until much later. Roy Morgan had been a deliberate man. Before he ever turned a wrench or planted a seed, he would walk the land. Slowly, unhurried, watching the way water pooled after rain, watching where the soil held moisture and where it dried too fast. He never explained this habit to Eli directly. He just did it every morning, and Eli watched him do it for 18 years without fully understanding why. After Roy died, Eli began to understand. He paid off the debts over the next 3 years through work that left him thin and tired in ways that sleep could not fully repair. He sold the newer tractor and kept the older one. He renegotiated the feed account and paid it down in installments. He planted what the land could support and nothing more. By the time he was 26, the farm was solvent, not prosperous. Solvent. There is a difference, and men who have lived on the wrong side of that line know exactly what it is. That was the year he met Vera. She was from a family 2 parishes over, the daughter of a man who ran a small hardware store. She was not a farm girl in the way that phrase sometimes implies. She did not romanticize the land or pretend that hard work was always beautiful, but she understood it. She understood that a man who checked the sky before going to bed was not anxious. He was paying attention. That distinction mattered to her, and it was one of the first things that told Eli she was someone he could build a life with. They married in the spring of 1977. Their son Harlan was born that same year, arriving in November with a set of lungs that announced his presence to the entire ward. And it was in that same year, the year of the marriage and the birth and the slow rebuilding of everything his father had left behind, that Eli Morgan first drove out to the stretch of low-lying wetland that sat several miles south of town at the edge of the parish, where the road turned to gravel and then to mud. He was not sure later what had drawn him there that first time. Curiosity, perhaps, or the habit his father had given him, the habit of looking carefully at things other people had already decided were not worth looking at. The land was 45 acres of flooded swamp. It had been abandoned for more than a decade. Locals called it Dead Man's Marsh, a name that had stuck so completely that most people had forgotten whether it had ever had another one. During the rainy months, water covered most of the ground. During dry periods, it became a thick, mosquito-heavy mudflat that smelled of sulfur and rot. Corn would not grow there. Soybeans had been tried and failed. Even cattle, which would graze almost anywhere, tended to avoid the area whenever they had a choice. Nobody wanted it. Nobody thought about it much at all. Eli parked his truck at the edge of the gravel road and walked the perimeter in the late afternoon light. The water was shallow, no more than a foot or two in most places, and it moved in slow patterns through the marsh grass. Birds he could not name waited in the shallows. The smell was strong and earthy. He stood there for a long time without taking any notes, without measuring anything, without forming any conclusions. He just looked. He came back the following week, and the week after that. By the end of that first year, he had established a routine so quiet and so consistent that almost nobody in Vermilion Parish knew it existed. After finishing work on his own farm each evening, he would drive out to Dead Man's Marsh Park, his truck, and walk. Sometimes for an hour, sometimes longer until the light failed and the insects grew loud enough to drive him back to the cab. Vera noticed the late evenings in the mud on his boots on days he had not been working the home farm. She noticed without asking, because she was the kind of woman who understood that some things needed to develop at their own pace before they could be spoken aloud. He brought a notebook starting in the spring of 1978, then a second one, then a measuring rod. He cut himself from a straight piece of pine marked at 1-inch intervals with a wood-burning tool. He began recording water depths at the same points each visit, building a record of seasonal change that no government survey had ever bothered to create for land this apparently useless. What Eli was discovering slowly, and without anyone to confirm or deny his observations, was that the marsh was not the dead place its name suggested. It was alive in a specific and disciplined way. Water entered from the north through two natural channels that most people had never mapped. It moved in predictable patterns across the clay-heavy floor of the wetland. It pooled in certain areas and drained from others with a consistency that changed by season, but repeated itself year after year with remarkable fidelity. The soil was the thing that interested him most. Heavy clay, dense and dark, the kind that stuck to a boot sole and came off in thick, reluctant slabs. Every farmer in the parish considered clay soil a problem. It drained poorly. It compacted easily. It was difficult to work with conventional equipment. The general understanding was that clay land needed to be amended or drained before it could become productive. Eli began to wonder if the general understanding was wrong. Not wrong for most purposes, wrong for this specific place. He was not a scientist. He had no agricultural degree. What he had was 10 years of his father's example and the growing record in his notebooks. And what that record told him year by year was that the clay floor of Dead Man's Marsh held water at exactly the right depth for exactly the right duration to create conditions that most crawfish farmers in the region spent significant money and effort trying to engineer artificially. The marsh was not fighting productivity. It was already configured for it. In the autumn of 1984, Eli drove nearly 3 hours north to Baton Rouge and spent a day at the Louisiana State University Agricultural Library. He was not a man who sought help easily or announced his intentions before he had tested them himself. But he had reached the limit of what he could confirm through observation alone, and he needed to know whether what he had been seeing for 7 years had any foundation beyond his own notebooks. The library was a plain building with long fluorescent lights and rows of shelves that smelled of old paper and binding glue. The woman who managed the archives was named Dorothy Crane. She was in her early 60s, small and precise, with silver hair pinned back from her face and wire-rimmed glasses that she adjusted frequently when she was reading. She had the particular stillness of someone who spent most of her life among documents and had learned to be very quiet in the presence of information. Eli described the marsh to her in the same careful language he used for everything specific, unhurried, without embellishment. He described the clay soil, the water depth, the seasonal patterns, the natural vegetation growing along the channels. He described what he had observed about the crawfish populations that appeared naturally in certain areas of the wetland each spring without any stocking or encouragement. Dorothy listened without interruption. When he finished, she removed her glasses, cleaned them slowly with a cloth from her desk drawer, and put them back on. She said, "You might want to wait here." She disappeared into a back storage room and returned 20 minutes later carrying a stack of research publications and agricultural reports, some of them typewritten on paper that had gone soft with age. She set them on the table in front of him without ceremony. "Most people don't ask about this," she said. "Crawfish farming on natural wetlands. There's more written on it than you'd think. Not much of it has made it out of academic circles." Eli sat at that wooden table for 2 full days. He read everything Dorothy brought him. The reports described farms built on low-lying Louisiana wetlands where the natural conditions had been used rather than eliminated. They explained water management techniques, breeding cycles, natural food chains, and yield projections from operations that had used the existing ecosystem as their foundation rather than trying to replace it. Everything in those reports described Dead Man's Marsh. Not approximately, not loosely, with a specificity that made the hair on Eli's arm stand up as he sat alone at that library table with fluorescent lights humming overhead and the smell of old paper around him. He drove back to Vermilion Parish in the dark, his mind running through the data he had spent 2 days absorbing. By the time he reached home, Vera was already asleep. He sat at the kitchen table alone and spread his own notebooks beside the photocopied pages Dorothy had allowed him to take. He compared everything. It matched. He knew what the marsh was for. He knew what he was going to do. He said nothing about it to anyone for another 3 years, waiting for the right moment, adding to the notebooks, watching the marsh go through 2 more full cycles of season and water and life. The county auction was held on a Thursday morning in September of 1987. It was the kind of Louisiana day that could not decide between summer and fall, warm enough for sweat, but with a restlessness in the air that suggested the season was about to turn. A crowd of perhaps 60 people filled the auction hall, most of them there for the smaller parcels that would come up first. Dead Man's Marsh was listed near the end of the schedule. 45 acres, flooded wetland, no improvements. Opening bid $1,800. Among the crowd standing near the back wall with his arms crossed was Frank Odom. Eli had known Frank for 11 years by then, since the winter of 1976, when Eli's father's tractor had thrown a rod 3 days before Christmas. Eli had driven to Frank's repair shop with exactly $40 in his pocket and a problem that would cost considerably more than that to fix. Frank had looked at the engine, looked at Eli, and fixed the tractor over 2 days without asking for full payment up front. He had taken the $40 and told Eli to settle the rest when he could. Eli had settled it within 60 days, and Frank had not forgotten. When the auctioneer reached the swamp parcel, the room shifted in a way that Eli recognized as collective amusement. Men crossed their arms. A few exchanged glances. Walt Decker stood near the center of the room, a large man in his late 50s, with white hair and a voice built for filling spaces, a rice farmer of some standing in the parish. Walt waited until the auctioneer had tried twice without a response, then said clearly enough for most of the room to hear, "That swamp isn't worth 1,800 pennies." Laughter moved through the crowd. Eli raised his hand. The room went quiet in a different way. The auctioneer pointed. 1,800 from Mr. Morgan. No one else bid. The gavel came down 30 seconds later. The laughter that followed was genuine and widespread. One man slapped his knee. Another shook his head slowly. Walt Decker grinned and called across the room, "Eli, if you're planning to fish it, you paid too much." What no one in that room knew was that the last entry in the fifth notebook, written the previous evening in Eli's careful compressed handwriting, read as follows. Soil confirmed. Water levels confirmed. Seasonal patterns confirmed. Research aligned. Ready. He had not walked into that room taking a chance on a piece of land. He had walked in after 10 years of observation, 3 years of waiting, and 2 days in a university library that had confirmed what he had already spent years suspecting. Every person in that building had looked at 45 acres of swamp and seen a liability. Eli had looked at the same 45 acres and seen the conclusion of a decade of quiet, methodical work. Outside the auction hall, Frank was waiting beside Eli's truck. He had come that morning not to buy anything himself, but because he had heard Eli was planning to bid on the marsh, and Frank Odom was the kind of man who showed up when something mattered to someone he respected. He had stood in the back of the room and watched the whole proceeding without saying a word, and he had not laughed. He looked at Eli when he came out. "If you need somebody who knows how to move dirt and fix equipment, I've got time." Eli looked at him for a moment, nodded. That was enough. He drove home through the warm afternoon with the deed in his jacket pocket. Vera was in the kitchen when he came in. She looked at him once, reading his face the way she had learned to do over 10 years of marriage, and did not say anything immediately. She poured him a cup of coffee and set it on the table. He sat down. He reached into the cabinet beside the refrigerator and took out all 5 notebooks one at a time and placed them on the table between them. Vera looked at the stack. She had seen them individually over the years, had known they existed, had chosen not to ask about them before they were ready to be explained. Now she picked up the first one and opened it. She read slowly, turning pages. She moved to the second notebook, then the third. She read for a long time without speaking. When she finally set the last notebook down, she looked at him across the table. "You've been watching that land since 1977, she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "You waited 10 years to buy it." "I needed to be sure." Vera looked at the notebooks again, then looked at her husband, at the careful face she knew better than any other face in the world, at the stillness in him that other people sometimes read as detachment, but that she understood was the opposite. It was attention. Complete and sustained attention turned for 10 years toward a piece of ground that the entire parish had written off as worthless. She understood in that moment something she had long suspected, but never had confirmed so plainly, that she had married a man who would not move until he was ready, and who was never wrong about when he was ready. She said, "You spent 10 years making sure before you spent $1,800. "Yes." She nodded once. "Then let's not waste those 10 years. The following morning, Eli drove out to Dead Man's Marsh before sunrise. He stood at the edge of the water in the gray early light, listening to the frogs and the birds moving through the reeds, feeling the soft give of the marsh ground beneath his boots. For the first time in 10 years, he was standing on land that belonged to him. He stayed there for a long time without moving. A great blue heron landed 50 yards out in the shallows and stood completely still, waiting with the patience of a creature that had never been in a hurry. Eli watched it. Then he opened the sixth notebook, knew its cover still stiff, its pages blank, uncapped his pen, and began to write. The first morning Eli Morgan owned Dead Man's Marsh, he stood at the water's edge until the light came up gray and slow over the reeds, and he felt the full weight of what he had committed to. $1,800. Every cent saved over 4 careful years, gone into ground that the entire parish considered a joke. He drove home. He ate breakfast. He went back to work on his own farm. And construction on the marsh began in January of 1988. The word construction is generous. What they were actually doing was shaping earth and water with old equipment, borrowed machinery, and a significant amount of physical labor that left both men exhausted by mid-afternoon. Frank drove a second-hand skid steer he had repaired himself from a machine another shop had considered beyond saving. Eli worked alongside him with a hand level, a measuring rod, and the sixth notebook in his back pocket. The plan required precision. Eli intended to reshape the existing marsh into a series of connected shallow ponds using the natural water channels as the foundation for a controlled flow system. Levees would separate the ponds and allow water levels to be managed independently. The clay floor of the wetland would serve exactly the purpose he had identified, holding water. At the depth, crawfish preferred creating the stable environment in which they bred most successfully. The work was slow. The mud was everywhere. More than once, both men sank past their knees trying to set stakes in areas that looked solid from a distance and were not. Equipment got stuck. Lines had to be remeasured when water shifted overnight. Frank repaired things as they broke, which was often, and never once complained about the pace or the conditions. By March, the basic shape of the pond system had begun to emerge. Standing on the highest ground at the northern edge of the property, Eli could see the outlines of what the farm would eventually become. The water was moving where he had calculated it would move, and staying where he needed it to stay, and that was enough. On a cool morning in late March of 1988, he drove to a crawfish hatchery 60 miles east and loaded the bed of his truck with the first breeding stock. He and Frank released them into the largest pond as the afternoon light came sideways through the marsh grass. The crawfish disappeared into the brown water within seconds, leaving only a brief disturbance on the surface that smoothed out and was gone. Frank stood beside Eli and watched the water settle. "How long before we know?" "We'll start to see juveniles in 6 to 8 weeks if conditions are right," Eli said. "We'll know if the system is working by fall." Frank nodded. "And if it isn't working, then we figure out why and we fix it." Frank accepted this without further comment. It was one of the things Eli valued most about him. He asked the hard questions, once got the honest answer, and moved forward without requiring reassurance. In town, the conversation had not changed. At the feed supply and at the diner on the main road and at the counter of the hardware store, the same assessment circulated in different forms. Eli Morgan had bought a swamp. He was trying to farm something people caught for free in drainage ditches. Walt Decker had developed a reliable version of the joke that he delivered at various locations around town, with the consistency of someone who had found a good routine and saw no reason to retire it. Then April arrived, and with it 3 days of rain that changed everything. The storm system came in from the Gulf on a Tuesday evening, moderate at first, then heavier through Wednesday, and by Thursday morning it had settled into the kind of sustained rainfall that southern Louisiana produces several times each decade. Eli checked the pond levels Wednesday evening and found them elevated but within range. He went home and told Vera the levees should hold. At 2 in the morning, he woke and lay still in the dark listening. Something in the quality of the silence had changed, and he was up and dressed before he was fully conscious of having made a decision. He drove to the marsh in the dark and found what he had been afraid of finding. 50 yards of the main levee on the eastern side of the largest pond had collapsed. The breach was not dramatic in the way of floods and films. It was simply a gap in the earth through which water was moving steadily, indifferent to the work that had stood in its way. Eli stood at the edge of the breach in the beam of his truck's headlights, with rain coming down on his shoulders, and looked at what the night had done. The feeling that went through him was not panic. It was something more specific and more difficult. The particular pain of a man who had been careful, who had planned, who had believed his preparation was sufficient and who was now standing in the dark looking at evidence that he had been wrong. He called Frank from a payphone at the gas station. Frank arrived 40 minutes later with rain gear and extra tools. They worked through the remainder of the night and into the gray morning packing and shoring the breach. By the time the rain stopped Thursday afternoon, the emergency repairs were holding. That evening, Eli sat on the tailgate of his truck at the edge of the property and thought clearly about what had happened. He had built the eastern levee to a height calculated from a government topographical survey produced in 1962. He had trusted those measurements because they were official and precise on paper. What he had not done was walk every section of that levee with his own equipment and verify the ground elevation independently. The survey map had been wrong by 8 inches at the point of failure. 8 inches that had put the structure 6 inches lower than he had calculated at its most vulnerable section. He had known the marsh. He had not known the limits of his own knowledge of it. Those were different things, and the difference had cost him a levee. He thought about his father, about something Roy Morgan used to say when equipment failed at the wrong moment, that the machine wasn't teaching you that you failed. It was teaching you what it needed. Eli had never fully understood that statement as a young man. He understood it now. The next morning, he began remeasuring every levee and every water control point on the property using his own equipment. It took 10 days. He found 2 other sections where the survey data did not match the actual ground. He corrected both before they became problems. He would never again trust an external measurement he had not personally verified. The months that followed brought new problems. Birds discovered the ponds. Great blue herons and white egrets, efficient hunters that could stand motionless in shallow water for hours and take juvenile crawfish in numbers significant enough to affect yield. Raccoons came at night working along the levee edges with the methodical patience of animals that were not hurrying. Eli dealt with each problem the same way, observing, carefully recording what he learned, adjusting his approach based on what the evidence actually told him. And then, the winter of 1989 arrived and brought with it the problem he had not seen coming. The man's name was Gerald Pruitt. He worked for an agricultural lending institution in the next parish, and he arrived on a Wednesday morning in December driving a clean car and carrying a briefcase. And he was polite in the specific way of men who are about to deliver news they know will not be well received. Eli's original farm, the 40-acre property he had inherited from his father, the land that represented the only unencumbered asset he possessed, was collateral on a small equipment loan taken out several years earlier. With his savings committed to the marsh and his attention divided, he had fallen behind on payments in a way that had seemed temporary and had become structural. Gerald Pruitt explained the situation carefully. Eli owed a specific amount. He had 90 days. If the account was not brought current, the institution would begin the process of collecting against the collateral. The collateral was the farm his father had died on. After Gerald Pruitt left, Eli stood in the doorway of his house for a long moment. Vera was inside. He could hear her moving in the kitchen. He did not go in immediately. He stood in the doorway and looked out at the yard and the bare winter fields and allowed the full weight of the situation to settle on him without trying to immediately calculate his way out of it. He was 2 years into a project that had not yet produced $1 of income. He had no savings left, and he was now facing the loss of the one piece of ground he could not afford to lose. Not financially, not in any sense. He could articulate, but that was as real as the mud on his boots. He called Frank that evening. Frank came the next morning, as he always came, without ceremony, driving up in his truck and getting out and pouring himself coffee from the thermos on the porch step as if he had been expected. Eli told him the number. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've got it." Eli shook his head. "Frank." "I've had it set aside," Frank said. "Different account. I wasn't using it for anything." "You've had it set aside," Eli repeated slowly. Frank looked at him steadily. "In case you needed it." Eli was silent. He looked at his friend, the broad hands wrapped around a coffee cup, the weathered face that did not change expression easily, the complete absence of performance in anything Frank Odom said or did. "I can't take your savings." "You didn't take anything," Frank said. "I'm handing it to you. There's a difference." He paused. 1981. You showed up at my shop and you wrote a check and you told me to use it and you didn't ask me anything except what the number was. Another pause longer. "I've been waiting 8 years for a chance to do the same thing. Don't take that away from me." The sentence landed with the full weight of what it meant. 8 years. Frank had been carrying that debt not as an obligation, but as an intention, waiting for the moment when he could balance an account that Eli had never expected to be balanced. Eli looked at his friend for a long time. Then he reached out and shook his hand, and neither man said anything more about it. He brought the loan current within 60 days. The farm stayed. Through 1990, as Eli continued working the marsh, something else happened that he had not anticipated. A representative arrived from an agricultural investment company based in Baton Rouge, a man in a pressed shirt who drove a car that was too clean for parish roads, and who introduced himself with the ease of someone accustomed to making offers that were accepted. The company, he explained, had become aware of Eli's operation through channels he did not specify. They were interested in acquiring the 45-acre parcel. They were prepared to offer $18,000. Eli said nothing for a moment. $18,000. 10 times what he had paid. Enough to clear every debt, restore every saving, and return his life to exactly the position it had been in before September of 1987. The representative seemed to take the silence as consideration and added that the offer was flexible, that there might be room to discuss terms. Eli looked at him. The property isn't for sale. The representative blinked. Mr. Morgan, $18,000 for 45 acres of wetland is a... I heard the number, Eli said. The property isn't for sale. After the man left, Eli stood in the yard for a long moment. He understood what the offer meant. It meant that people with money and resources and access to information had looked at what he was building and concluded it had value. It meant he was right. It meant that what he had spent 13 years working toward, 10 years of observation and 3 years of construction and 2 years of setbacks, was real enough that strangers were willing to pay 10 times the purchase price to take it from him. He went back to work. He called Dorothy Crane that evening, not because he suspected her of anything, but because he was curious how the company had learned about the operation. Dorothy was quiet for a moment on the line. Then she told him, with the careful honesty of a woman who did not make excuses for herself, that she had presented a summary of the wetland crawfish research at an agricultural symposium in Baton Rouge 6 months earlier. She had included a reference to a working operation in Vermilion Parish that was demonstrating the principles in practice. She had not used his name, but apparently the description had been specific enough. She apologized. Eli thought about it honestly. Dorothy, he said finally, you just told me that people with money have figured out I'm doing something right. That's not bad news. A long pause on the line. Then Dorothy laughed, a short, surprised sound. I suppose it isn't, she said. He thanked her and hung up. Then he went out to walk the levees before the light was gone, because there was always something that needed checking, and the day was not finished yet. By midsummer of 1990, conditions had stabilized. Eli had reinforced the vulnerable section, solved most of the predator problems through modifications that cost more time than money, and developed a water management rotation that kept conditions consistent across all 3 pond sections through different weather patterns. The operation was functioning. It was not yet profitable in any significant sense, but it was functioning, and that was the foundation everything else would be built on. In October of 1991, on a cool morning when the light was coming low and golden through the marsh grass, Eli pulled on his waders and walked the full perimeter of the pond system. In the 3rd pond, in an area that had received no direct stocking since the initial release, he found crawfish burrows. Not a few. Dozens of them distributed across the clay bank in a pattern that could only mean one thing. The population was reproducing independently. The system had reached a point of self-sustaining biological function. The marsh was not simply holding the crawfish he had placed into it. It was supporting a living, breeding population that was expanding on its own terms, doing what it had probably always been configured to do, waiting for someone to stop trying to fight it and start working with it instead. He stood in the middle of the 3rd pond in his waders, with the water around his knees and the morning light on the surface. He opened his notebook to the current page and wrote in the careful handwriting he had been applying to these notebooks for 13 years, October 10th, 1991. Confirmed independent reproduction across all 3 southern ponds. System functioning. He looked at the words for a moment. Then he capped his pen, closed the notebook, and stood there in the water a while longer. Not because there was more to observe, but because the moment felt like the kind that does not come back a second time, and he wanted to be fully present in it before it passed. Frank was waiting on the levee bank when Eli waded back. He had seen Eli's face from a distance and had understood something had changed without being told what it was. Eli climbed up the bank and handed Frank the open notebook. Frank read the entry. He read it again. Then he handed the notebook back without saying anything. They stood there together on the levee in the October light, the marsh alive and moving around them, and neither man felt the need to fill the silence with words. The spring of 1992 arrived in Vermilion Parish the way good things sometimes arrive after long waiting. Not with fanfare, not with sudden drama, but with a quiet accumulation of evidence that something had genuinely and permanently changed. The mornings were cooler than usual through March, the kind of clear, dry Louisiana days that made the marsh look sharper against the sky. Eli was out before sunrise most mornings walking the levees with his notebook and his measuring rod checking water levels with the same methodical patience he had applied to every season since January of 1988. But something was different now, and he knew it before he had the numbers to confirm it. The signs were in the mud at the pond edges, in the density of burrow openings along the clay banks, in the weight of the trap cages when he lifted them from the water which had been increasing steadily through February in a way the previous 3 years had never shown. In the first week of April, he pulled the harvest traps in the pre-dawn darkness, with Frank managing the rope lines on the opposite bank. The cages came up heavy. The first one was heavier than he expected, the second heavier still. By the time they had worked through a third of the trap line, both men understood that something had crossed a threshold. They sorted the crawfish in the beam of the truck headlights, the sorting table covered in clean burlap, the night still and cool around them. The numbers that emerged from that first serious harvest exceeded every projection Eli had written in his notebooks in 1988, when he had sat at his kitchen table after returning from Baton Rouge and calculated what the marsh could reasonably produce if the system worked as he believed it would. He stood at the sorting table with the 6th, 7th, and 8th notebooks open beside the harvest tally, comparing projections from 4 years ago with the actual figures in front of him. After a long time, he closed all 3 notebooks. "Well," Frank said. "Yes," Eli said. That was the entirety of the conversation. It was enough. Word traveled in the particular way of small Louisiana parishes, which is to say it traveled quickly. The trucks that began arriving at the marsh entrance road were not enormous, but they were real and consistent and visible from the main road in a way that made them impossible to ignore. Carl Whitfield drove down from near Lake Charles in late April. He was 46 years old, lean and precise, the son of a commercial fishing family who had built a seafood distribution company from a single refrigerated truck into a regional operation with accounts across southwestern Louisiana and into East Texas. He had received the first sample shipment from Eli's operation through a broker contact, found it sufficiently consistent to request a second, and found the second impressive enough to make the drive himself. He spent the better part of an afternoon walking the ponds with Eli, asking specific questions. How water levels were managed through dry months, what the breeding cycle looked like across different pond sections, how yield had tracked season over season since initial stocking. Eli answered every question directly and without inflation. He showed Carl the harvest records and the water management logs from the previous 4 years. Carl read them with the focused attention of someone accustomed to evaluating data. At the end of the afternoon, Carl stood at the edge of the main pond. "I've seen newer operations than this with 3 times the infrastructure produce half the yield," he said. Eli said nothing. "The consistency is what I care about," Carl continued. "I can find product. I can't always find product. I can rely on quarter to quarter." He looked at Eli. "Are you reliable, Mr. Morgan?" "I've been out here before sunrise most mornings for 4 years," Eli said. "You can make your own judgment about that." Carl Whitfield smiled for the first time since arriving. It was brief and genuine, the kind worn by men who do not smile easily and mean it when they do. The supply agreement they signed the following week was not a large contract by regional industry standards. What it was and what Eli understood it to be with complete clarity was a foundation, the first structure built on top of 4 years of invisible, unrewarded work. For the first time since signing the deed to Dead Man's Marsh in September of 1987, Eli Morgan could plan in years rather than months. The change in town was gradual, then visible, then impossible to deny. Walt Decker was sitting at his usual table at the diner on a Thursday morning in May when 2 trucks with a seafood distribution company's logo drove past the window, heading south toward the Marsh Road. He watched them go without speaking. He stirred his coffee. He did not make a joke. Gene Harmon came to find Eli in June. Gene was in his early 60s, a big man with white stubble and sun-damaged skin and 40 years of farming written in every line of his face. He had been at the auction in 1987. He had laughed. He was not the kind of man who found apologies easy, but he was the kind of man who understood when he owed one, which is a different and rarer quality. He found Eli resetting a water control gate on the north end of the property and stood at a respectful distance until Eli looked up. Then he walked over and said without preamble that he had been wrong in 1987, and he knew it, and he was not there to make excuses for it. Eli set down his tools. "You want to walk the ponds?" They spent 2 hours walking the property. Eli explained the water management system, the pond design, the way the clay soil had been used rather than fought against. He explained it the same way he would have explained it to anyone who genuinely wanted to understand, without condescension and without reference to the history between them. Gene asked good questions. By the time they reached the southern boundary, he was looking at a section of his own difficult ground in an entirely different way. Later that month, through Frank, Eli learned something that Gene had apparently mentioned elsewhere. Walt Decker had quietly attempted to start a crawfish operation on a wet section of his own land sometime around 1990. He had used none of Eli's methodology, none of the observation or water management principles, none of the research-based approach that the whole system depended on. He had put crawfish in standing water and waited for them to multiply. The operation had failed within a single season. Walt had absorbed the loss privately and said nothing to anyone. Eli heard this and was still for a moment. Then he got in his truck and drove to Walt Decker's property. Walt came out of his barn when he heard the truck. He stood in the yard with his arms at his sides and watched Eli get out with the expression of a man who has been preparing for a conversation he does not know how to begin. Eli walked up to him. "Gene told me about the pond." Walt said nothing. "I'm not here about that," Eli said. "I'm here because I know what went wrong, and I think I can show you why if you want to walk the ground with me." Walt looked at him for a long time. "Why would you do that?" Eli thought about it honestly before answering. "Because there's more than enough water in this parish for more than one person to get this right," he said. "And because it's not something I'm interested in keeping to myself." Walt opened the gate. They walked Walt's wet ground for an hour. Eli identified the problems immediately. The wrong pond depth, the wrong soil profile, the absence of any water management infrastructure. He explained what would need to change and roughly what it would cost and how long it would take before results were visible. He spoke without self-congratulation and without reference to 1987, and Walt listened with the uncomfortable attention of a man who is learning something he should have asked to be taught years earlier. When they finished, Walt stood at the edge of his failed pond. "I should have asked you before I tried it," he said. "Yes," Eli said, "but you didn't know enough yet to know what to ask." It was the most generous interpretation available, and Walt understood that Eli had chosen it deliberately. He nodded once, which meant the same thing as a longer speech would have meant and cost considerably less. The years that followed built on each other with the cumulative logic of things that have been properly founded. Carl Whitfield's contract expanded in its second year and again in its third. Other buyers found their way to the Marsh Road. The operation grew not through dramatic reinvention, but through the same steady accumulation of careful work that had characterized every stage of its development. Eli hired 2 men from the parish to help with harvest seasons. He expanded 2 of the ponds. He improved the water management system based on things the first 4 years had taught him. He taught Harlan everything. This was perhaps not obvious to anyone watching from outside, because the teaching did not look like teaching in any formal sense. There were no scheduled lessons, no curriculum. What there was from the time Harlan was old enough to walk the levees without being a danger to himself was presence. Eli took his son on the morning rounds and explained what he was looking at and why. He showed Harlan how to read water movement, how to assess soil condition by feel and by observation, how to tell from the pattern of burrow openings whether a pond section was healthy or stressed. More importantly, he explained the decisions, not just what they were, but why they were made. Why this pond was deeper than that one. Why the water was managed differently in spring than in fall. Why the eastern levee had been rebuilt to a different specification than the western one, and what had taught him the difference. He did not leave these things to be absorbed by proximity or guessed at from results. He said them plainly in the same careful language he applied to everything, because he understood that knowledge which is not transferred is knowledge that ends with the man who holds it. By the time Harlan was a grown man managing significant portions of the daily operation, he could read the marsh the way his father could read it. He could see what was coming before it arrived and respond to problems before they became failures. He had not merely inherited a farm, he had inherited a way of seeing. And then Emmett began asking questions. Harlan's son was 15 years old in the autumn of 2015, and he asked questions the way some people breathe continuously and without apparent effort. He was tall for his age, with his father's build beginning to show in his shoulders and a quickness in his face that came from Vera's side of the family. He was not quiet the way Eli was quiet. He processed the world out loud in an ongoing stream of inquiry that occasionally exhausted the people around him and never seemed to exhaust himself. Eli found this entirely pleasing. He walked the ponds with Emmett on autumn afternoons and answered every question, sometimes directly, and sometimes by saying, "Walk to that bank and tell me what you see," which was the answer his own observation had taught him was more valuable than any explanation. Emmett would walk to the bank, crouch down, look at the mud and the water and the burrow patterns, and come back with something that was sometimes wrong and sometimes startlingly accurate and always genuine. 3 generations on the same levees, the same clay soil, the same patterns of water moving through the same channels that Eli had first mapped in notebooks with a pine measuring rod in the late 1970s. One afternoon in October of 2015, a regional agricultural journalist named David Pratt drove out from Lafayette to write about the marsh. He was thorough and unhurried, and he spent most of the afternoon asking Eli questions that ranged from the technical details of water management to the larger arc of what had happened here: the auction, the years of silence and struggle, the success that had outlasted every prediction of failure. By any reasonable measure, the numbers told a story that required no embellishment. The 45 acres that had sold in 1987 for $1,800, while a room full of people laughed, had been appraised at last count at a value more than 200 times that original purchase price. The operation employed local workers through every harvest season. It had supplied regional seafood markets consistently for more than 2 decades. It had become, without anyone quite noticing it happen, one of the most respected wetland crawfish operations in southwestern Louisiana. At the end of the afternoon, sitting at the edge of the main levee, as the light began to change, David Pratt asked the question he had clearly been saving. "What was the secret?" he said. "If you had to name one thing, one decision, or one insight that made this work when everything suggested it wouldn't, what would it be?" Eli was quiet for a long moment. He stood up from the levee bank and said, "Come with me." He walked Pratt to the edge of the first pond, the original pond, the one where he and Frank had released the first breeding stock on a cool March afternoon in 1988, with no audience and no ceremony. The water was dark and still in the late afternoon light. A few egrets stood in the shallows on the far bank, motionless in the way of birds that are not resting but working. Eli looked at the water. "Everybody who looked at this land saw something dead," he said. "They saw standing water where corn should be. They saw mud where a pasture should be. They saw the wrong thing in the wrong place." He paused. "I saw land that nobody had taken the time to understand yet. Those are different things, and the difference between them is the whole story." Pratt wrote that down. Then he looked up. "How long did it take you to understand it?" 10 years to ask the right questions," Eli said. 4 more to hear the answers." Pratt nodded slowly. He looked out at the egrets standing still in the fading light. "And the people who laughed at the auction, what do you think they saw when they looked at this place?" Eli considered this seriously, the way he considered all questions that deserved a serious answer. "They saw what it was," he said. "I tried to see what it could be. That's the only difference between us." After David Pratt's car had disappeared down the gravel road, Eli walked the full perimeter of the marsh alone. He did this periodically, not for any operational reason, but because the habit of walking and observing was so deeply built into him by now that it felt less like something he chose to do and more like something he simply was. The light was failing by the time he reached the southern boundary, the sky going from orange to deep red over the flat Louisiana horizon. The marsh was loud with the end-of-day sounds, frogs in the shallows, birds settling into the reeds, the constant low-frequency presence of water moving through grass. He stood at the southern levee and looked back across the full length of the property. 45 acres. The same 45 acres that had sold for $1,800 while a room full of people laughed. The same ground that had flooded and resisted and tested him. The same clay soil everyone had called a liability, and that had turned out to be the foundation of everything. He thought about his father, about Roy Morgan walking the fields before sunrise, observing without agenda, learning without needing anyone to know he was learning. About a lesson given without words and received the same way across years and across the silence between fathers and sons that contains more than most conversations ever managed to hold. He thought about Frank Odom, who had shown up at an auction and stood in the back of the room and not laughed, and who had later handed over 20 years of savings because a debt of the heart needed settling, and he would not be argued out of it. Frank was 63 now, moving more slowly than he once had, but he still drove out to the marsh sometimes in the mornings and drank coffee on the levee bank and watched the water with the same quiet attention he had always brought to everything. He thought about Vera, who had looked at 5 notebooks spread across a kitchen table and seen not a risk, but a man she already understood, who had said 4 words that contained everything necessary and had never once in 38 years of marriage given him reason to doubt that she had meant every one of them. She was in the house now, he knew, probably reading, probably with the radio on low, the way she liked it in the evenings. He would be home before full dark. He thought about Harlan, who had grown into a man who could run this place without being told how, because the knowledge had passed between them across hundreds of mornings and thousands of small explanations and the simple accumulated weight of shared work. And he thought about Emmett, 15 years old, and already unable to walk past a pond bank without crouching down to look at the mud. The last light left the sky. Eli walked back along the levee toward the truck, his boots finding the familiar path without needing to look down. Near the entrance, a light was still on in the small office building. Through the window, he could see Harlan at the desk working through the week's harvest records. And at the table beside him, barely visible in the lamp's reach, Emmett was bent over something, a notebook, Eli realized. A new one. The cover was clean, the spine unbroken, the pages white. Emmett was writing in it with the focused attention of a boy who has recently discovered that observation is worth recording, that the things you notice and write down become the foundation of the things you eventually understand. Eli stopped outside the window and watched this without going in. The notebook was new. Whatever Emmett was writing on the first page would be the beginning of something none of them could fully see. Yet the way the first entry in a notebook about an abandoned Louisiana swamp in 1978 had been the beginning of something that no one had believed in except the man holding the pen. He stood outside in the cooling dark and felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has built something that will outlast him, not in concrete or steel, but in the habits of mind that pass from one generation to the next, when a man takes the time to share not just what he knows, but how he learned to know it. The willingness to look at what others have dismissed, to stay long enough for the ground to tell you what it knows, to trust what you have observed over what you have been told to expect. The marsh was alive around him. The frogs were loud in the reeds. Somewhere in the southern ponds, in the dark, in the shallow water and the clay that everyone had called worthless crawfish, were doing what they had always done in this place, moving through the channels that Eli had shaped to match what the land already wanted to do. It had never needed to be fixed. It had never needed to be drained or converted or made into something more acceptable. It had needed simply to be seen by someone patient enough to look and stubborn enough to keep looking and humble enough to let the land teach him rather than insisting on teaching the land. Eli Morgan had been that person. Not because he was smarter than the men who had laughed at the auction. Not because he had access to knowledge or resources they did not, but because his father had walked the fields every morning before speaking, and that habit had passed to a son who had spent 10 years walking a swamp. Nobody wanted filling notebooks. Nobody read, asking questions. Nobody else thought to ask until the answers were clear enough that a single entry in the 5th notebook could be written in 2 words. Ready. He went inside.